Hello and welcome to Live from FSS. I'm Scott Wolfson, your host and the owner of Florida Sun Studios. Live from FSS is a new online show that we broadcast here weekly, every Thursday 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. And the show serves as a platform for all those interested in hosting your own show, getting your brand out there, your message out there, promoting your company. Maybe you have had aspirations or dreams of becoming the next big network news talk show host, sports personality, or reality TV host, and you've realized that the chances of attaining your own show are rather slim to none. Well, that's where Live from FSS comes into the mix. We provide that professional platform for you. We give you everything that you see on the network news and sports TV every day, all the bells and whistles, everything from multiple camera angles, in-studio guests, graphics, titles, and much, much more. The show is filled with useful tips and techniques that you too could use in your own productions. We take you behind the scenes in many of our taped and live productions, and each week we have a featured guest. We interview industry experts in their respective fields. Coming up shortly, I'm going to introduce you to Ivan Eland. He's a foreign policy expert and a regular guest contributor here at FSS. Before we get to Ivan, though, I want to tell you a little bit about Florida Sun Studios, or FSS as we're commonly known in the industry if you're not familiar with us. Florida Sun Studios is an independent broadcast studio located in beautiful downtown Fort Lauderdale. We're near the major attractions, the downtown businesses, the seaport, the airport, the Port Everglades. We are centrally located near the highways, right in a central spot. We service all the major news and sports networks, everyone from Fox News, CNN, ESPN, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNBC, I-24 News, and basically every other acronym that brings you news. We are also a full-service video production company offering the following services: satellite media tours, corporate videos, internet shows, now offering Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Periscope shows. And now, without any further ado, I want to introduce to you this week's guest, a friend of mine, a frequent guest here, foreign policy expert, Ivan Eland. Ivan, pleasure having you on the set today for today's show.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.
We're going to focus on foreign policy since that's what your bread and butter is. But before we get into the nook and crannies of foreign policy and all the hot spots blowing up around the world, I want our audience to kind of get to know who Ivan Eland is, the person. What are your interests? Tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, I like to run. I'm a runner. I like to work out. I like to go to sporting events, baseball, football. Just got married in October. So
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
And your beautiful wife is sitting in the control room now, watching the broadcast live.
Right, Bonnie. So
shout out to Bonnie.
Yeah, definitely.
And a shout out to all our Facebook viewers who are joining us for today's live broadcast. We encourage all of you to join the broadcast, become engaged, send us your questions and comments, and Ivan and myself will do our best to answer all your questions and comments during the broadcast. For those of you we don't get to during the broadcast, we will do so after. The broadcast will also be repurposed on Facebook as well as the Florida Sun Studios website, which is floridasunstudios.com, and we'll have a video on Vimeo and the edited version later on today too. Now, getting back with Ivan. So you're a sports guy, a family man, you recently got married. How did you become involved? Tell us your education background. How did you become involved in the world of foreign policy?
Well, I was an undergraduate at Iowa State, and Henry Kissinger, who had been the Secretary of State, of course he was retired at the time, came and gave a lecture at the university. And so I attended that, and I thought, wow, that would be kind of an interesting career. So I started looking into graduate programs, and I went to Washington, D.C., to George Washington University, where I got a master's of business administration in applied economics, and then I went on to get a PhD in national security policy. So that's how, and then I worked for Congress for 15 years on foreign policy and national security, and the intelligence community and that sort of thing. And then I got into the think tank world where I am now, and many former government officials and congressional staffers and that sort of thing, even congressmen and senators get into the think tank area. And these are research institutes in Washington. There's many of them. I happen to work for one actually based in California, but we have a Washington office called the Independent Institute.
And let me ask you, so you have the education background in Washington from foreign policy. Have you advised any past presidents?
Well, no, but I've I worked on the Ron Paul as a foreign policy advisor to the presidential campaign that he ran, his first one, and so I have a little bit of experience in that. But I've been mostly on the congressional side of foreign policy, House Foreign Affairs Committee, and then I work for the Congressional Budget Office in their national security area.
Now, interesting, your take, and we're not going to get too political, but you come from much of a libertarian point of view, I would say, in foreign policy. Would that be correct to say?
Right.
A non-interventionist?
Yes, I would say it mirrors sort of the founders' version of what U.S. foreign policy was going to be, because the founders realized that the United States was far away from the foreign areas of foreign conflict, and that it had the luxury of two big ocean moats as a buffer. And it's very hard to move military forces across such wide oceans, and it still is to this day, and probably will be for a long time. So I think the United States probably needs to go back to that foreign policy, simply because most of the conflicts in the world now are not across borders, they're within countries. And that's actually, it's a bad thing for the country, but it's a good thing for U.S. security, because most of our potential conflicts that really affect our security are across border, and that has been dramatically reduced since World War II. And so I think, we have a $20 trillion debt now, and we're not as economically dominant as we used to be. And one of the reasons is because we've taken some of what Trump has to say is true. We've taken a lot of hits from our allies simply because they don't open their markets to us but but we defend them, and we spend a lot of money defending them. And I think that's Trump is capitalizing on people's concern about that. And I think we need to let our allies do more, which means we can do less, save money, and put it back into our economy.
Now, you're also an accomplished author. You've written more than a half a dozen books, I think 7.
I've written 6. The 7th one is, it's written. It's in the process to be published.
Okay, we're teasing the book.
Right.
And you're also a contributor, a regular contributor. Your articles are featured in all the major U.S. news publications, USA Today, Chicago Sun-Times, Miami Herald, New York Times. And you're also a frequent guest of mine when you're down here in Fort Lauderdale at Florida Sun Studios, as well as when you're in D.C. on Al Jazeera, CCTV, saw you on CNN. You're one guy, expert, go-to guy when stuff blows up and they need to have someone to explain these difficult, complicated, complex subjects to the American public. Because a lot of the public, from my understanding and the way I see, they seem so isolated from what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in North Korea, and they think, well, it's happening there, it doesn't really affect me. What's your take on that? I mean, should we be concerned about world events, every one of us?
Well, I think people should be concerned about what's going on overseas, but not necessarily threatened by it. I think the foreign policy elite spends a lot of their money policing some of these areas, which the American people should say, well, they need to evaluate, do we really need to be here or there? Is this a conflict that we really should be involved in? Like, the foreign policy elite are really convinced that we should have gotten involved in the Syrian civil war. And we have, but not big time. But I think a lot of people in the foreign policy elite would like to push us further into that conflict. But of course, to a casual observer, you look at our record in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, where we've, specifically in Iraq and Libya, where we overthrew leaders who are keeping these countries together. And
Right,
these were not nice leaders, but
we
now
overthrew
have
Saddam
chaos.
Hussein, and what did it give us? It gave us Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And then you mentioned, it goes back between both Democrat and Republican
Yes,
administrations, not just one to blame, and you can't just blame one party for everything. We're in this together. So we got rid of a madman, Saddam Hussein, and then we got Al-Qaeda in Iraq as a result of that, because under Saddam's tyrannical rule, the quote-unquote terrorist groups didn't flourish.
Right. And this idea that we're going to overthrow Assad, I can't believe there are still people that want to do that, because they think, well, if we get democracy in Syria, then we won't have any terrorism. And academic study shows that when you put a democracy in, a new democracy like Iraq, that terrorism is higher than in an autocracy. And eventually, if it can become a mature democracy, the terrorism will go back down. But if you're installing democracies in certain places, like Iraq is a very flawed democracy, if that's what you want to call it, because the majority is oppressing the minority. And of course, that's represented by ISIS now. The reason the Sunni minority in Iraq supports ISIS is because they fear the government, the Shiite government, more. And that we put that government in there. And I think we have to watch it. This idea that you're going to go in and put in democracies and we're going to have less terrorism, it's a fallacy.
A fallacy that was committed by both the Bush and Obama administration.
Yes, well, Barack Obama took a look at what we did in Iraq by overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and we got chaos and terrorism, and he decided to do the same thing. He was actually talked into it by the French. I'm not sure he really wanted to do it, but he was talked into it, and that's bad enough, and he overthrew Gaddafi.
Gaddafi in Libya, right.
Yes,
now look what we got there. We got
right.
ISIS running wild.
Right, and we also created another inadvertent problem, which we're probably going to talk about here, is North Korea. And North Korea looks out there and it sees that we overthrew Saddam, no nuclear weapons. He didn't have nuclear weapons. Gaddafi, it's even worse. He gave up his nuclear weapons and
right.
was playing, he was playing
he was
nice
playing
with
ball
the
with
West.
us, right?
Yes, he was playing ball, and we still overthrew him. So, and if you're a paranoid leader, which Kim Jong-un is in North Korea, you look at that and go, I got to get nuclear weapons, right?
And we look in recent weeks, the escalation by the North Korean regime, their provocative tactics of thankfully failed missile launches. What type of threat does North Korea and their nuclear program, do they pose to South Korea, their neighbor right there, the U.S., and the world in general?
Well, I think we have to differentiate. They certainly are a threat to the South. There, and their threat to Japan lobbing some of these missiles. They have missiles that have ranges that can do an attack within the region. They don't yet have a missile that can hit the U.S., and they don't have a warhead that they can shrink the warhead to fit on that missile. You need a long-range ICBM, and they have some ICBMs, but they've not been flight tested. So it'll probably be 4 to 10 years before they can get a missile that will hit us with a nuclear weapon, and that's a good thing. But I think we don't want to inflate the threat from this, because during the Cold War, we relied on nuclear deterrence. That is, we had thousands of nuclear weapons, and we deterred the Soviet Union and radical Maoist China, who also got nuclear weapons in the 60s. And remember, Mao was threatening to nuke the United States at the time. We deterred them from doing it because they don't want their countries incinerated. Well, this is a small country. He's going to have, a few weapons he can get here initially, maybe more later, but he's definitely still deterrable. And I think that's the good news in it. Sure, we would like him to get rid of his nuclear program, but we haven't been successful in getting him to do that by negotiations, because he's pledged to do it and then he violated the agreement.
Right, and they say that China is the biggest, quote-unquote, trump card in negotiating with North Korea. But when Trump came to office, he was, very vehement about the manipulation of currency, want to slap on tariffs. He's kind of walked back some of that rhetoric because do you think maybe it's because he sees China being able to leverage them to deal with North Korea?
Yeah, I think he's actually said that they would get China would get a better trade deal if they help us out with North Korea. And China, he's right. I think China is the key there because a lot of the trade, oil, financial services, food goes across that border into North Korea. The Chinese do not want the regime to collapse in North Korea because, number one, they'll get a lot of refugees, but number two, they do not want the same thing that happened in Europe to happen there, where Germany was reunited under the NATO alliance, which is run by the U.S. South Korea and North Korea could reunite under, of course, a South Korean regime, and that would be under U.S. alliance, and they would have U.S. listening posts and troops right on their border, and the Chinese don't like that possibility. So they're a little bit reluctant to pressure North Korea, but I think that even the Chinese are getting fed up with this guy because he's not a very good ally, and he's very erratic. And the Chinese trade a lot with Japan and South Korea. They don't trade with North Korea. It's a destitute communist economy.
But North Korea needs China, though.
Yes, yes. So you would say, well, why do they, they have all the cards, but this guy somehow, they don't want, his weakness is his strength. They don't want him to collapse because that'll bring even more problems.
He's not a rational person.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that's true. I think he is a rational person. I think he's crazy like a fox. I think he
feeds his family members to the wolves, literally, rabid dogs.
He's a bit more unstable, I think, than his father and grandfather, but they have a tradition in that country of tweaking the West to get more food aid, and we've been, unfortunately, our presidents of both parties have been giving him attention and food aid, and that's what they want. And whenever they're feeling that they're being ignored or they need more food aid, they go out and do something, and then we either pay them to stop it with the food aid, or we give them some other sort of attention, and that's why this continues.
I want to say, if you're joining us just now, this is Live from FSS, a weekly show we produce and broadcast every Thursday, 11 a.m. on Facebook. My guest today is foreign policy expert Ivan Eland, and we want to give a shout out to Bonnie Monroe, Breon DeSeller, and Bruce Serban, who are watching the broadcast, as well as Michael Richmond. Thank you all for watching. Please send us your questions and comments. And pivoting from North Korea, I would say, other hot spot, we go from one side of the world to the other, Syria. When major reason, or one of the major things that propelled Trump to win was this America First foreign policy and maybe not getting involved in battles that were not directly affecting us. And but then he pulled a 180. He ordered a U.S. attack on one of their air bases. Do you see a hypocrisy in that? I mean, what was his change of heart there? The pictures that he saw on TV of Bashar al-Assad's people being gassed?
Well, I think that was part of it, but also the Chinese leader happened to be visiting then, and it may have been a signal to him because he was saying, listen, if you don't make your client get rid of its nuclear weapons or at least suspend it, this is what could happen to them. But I think that's probably a lame threat because, as I mentioned before, North Korea already has nuclear weapons. We treat them much differently than we treat Assad, Muammar Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, that sort of thing. So I think this was sort of a signal to this regime in North Korea and also their Chinese benefactor. But it really didn't do that much because North Korea, everybody recognizes, including North Korea, that it's a different animal than the Syrian regime.
Syria is just a mess. I mean, any way you look at it, I mean, it's almost like, I think, your enemies. You got, on one side, you got the Iranian regime, which supports Syria. We know Moscow and Putin support them, and Hezbollah. Those are all sworn enemies of, well, not Russia, but Hezbollah and Iran and Syria are sworn enemies of Israel. And then you have sectarian strife going on in the country, civil war. You have ISIS. You have Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra. I mean, is it like walking a plank if you get involved there? Do I take Captain Hook on one side and the gator's ready to swallow me whole on the other? I mean, Rand Paul thinks it's a mistake that we get involved there, and he thinks that both McCain and Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham, have it wrong. The Warhawks have it wrong. How do you see it as a libertarian?
Well, I think he's right, and I think if Otto von Bismarck, the famous Iron Chancellor of Germany, was around, who was very into realpolitik, he would say, when your enemies are fighting, let them. We have ISIS and the Al-Qaeda affiliate on one side. You have Assad, Hezbollah, and Iran on the other side, and Russia on the other side. If you help one, you're going to hurt the other one. But if you're going to hurt one, you're going to help the other one, and you don't want to do that. So I think the best thing to do is probably stay out of it. And I think Obama got dragged in a little bit, and Trump is in danger of being dragged even more because he wants to be a tough guy. Now, if this strike was to show, listen, Obama said he set a red line, and Syria used chemical weapons, and he didn't do anything to them, and I'm going to do that. I'm a tough guy. Okay, you signaled you're a tough guy, but do you really want to get involved in this?
Right. Some say it was a one-off. Okay,
yes.
It shows them.
Well, I'd be happier if it was just a one-off. I think because getting involved in this thing, you're going to get bogged down. I think we ought to let Russia have its. They
have influence there.
Yeah, well, they have influence, but they're also bogged down. They're also, once you get in, it's much easier to get involved in a war than to get out of it, as we found out in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq, right? All of those we've had trouble getting out of.
I mean, you look at Israel, what they're dealing with there, they seem to have your view, stay away from it, unless mortars or, fire is
right,
sent there, or they've actually gone after, Hezbollah convoys of shipments, arms.
It's very limited, though.
But it's limited, right? Airstrikes. They don't comment on it. It's almost just like a tactical response to what could be a threat in the Golan Heights and other areas. Do they have the right idea about it?
Yes, because they are following Otto von Bismarck's, because all those people fighting in Syria are enemies of Israel. And if you can keep them from fighting. Now, they don't like the instability on their border, but they're policing their border, and as you mentioned, they're doing these strikes to prevent Hezbollah from attacking them. But Hezbollah is tied down. Their main enemy now is tied down there, as is Al-Qaeda and as is Assad, who was an enemy of theirs as well. So they're following Bismarck's what Bismarck would say, and that is that when your enemies are fighting, let them.
Let me ask you, we could talk foreign policy all day today, but I want to kind of go from another topic, Syria, going to Iran. The Iranian nuclear deal that was signed by was it the P5 countries? What was it called?
Mm-hmm.
The P5 countries. What are your thoughts on the actual deal that was signed? Was it a good, bad deal for the world? And is it working? Is Iran abiding by those agreements?
Well, I think most people agree that they're abiding by the agreements. Trump doesn't like it. And yesterday, Rex Tillerson said that Iran is still a state sponsor of terrorism. But of course, that wasn't part of the agreement. The agreement was limited to their nuclear program. And I think, I don't think you could do much else with that. It's a pretty good agreement as far as it goes. The one thing that hasn't been publicized is that the one aspect that could actually hurt the United States more than anything else was the plutonium program that they had. There's two ways to make a nuclear weapon, but plutonium is more powerful than uranium, and they shut that reactor down and put cement in it. And so I think that's really the weapons that could eventually hit the U.S. Iran is like North Korea, didn't have the missiles to hit the United States yet.
But wasn't there a 24 or 28-day wait period that they had to possibly hide weaponry underground and stuff?
Well, the inspections, there's always problems with inspections, and it can't be perfect. But the alternative, and Israel and Saudi Arabia and all the enemies of Iran are better off even if they cheat somewhat on that agreement is 10 to 15 years long. And I think they're probably better off that this is definitely impeding, if nothing else, the Iranian nuclear program. And I think one of the main reasons that Israel and Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries are opposing this is not necessarily the nuclear aspects of it, because I think a lot of nuclear experts think it's pretty good agreement as far as inspections go and that sort of thing. The real problem with these countries is that they're afraid that we're going to better relations with Iran and their relations with the United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, other Arab states will diminish because the balance of power will change. And I don't think really I think that's sort of an unfounded fear, because we still don't get along with Iran because of its fundamentalist Islamist.
Their support of terrorism.
Right.
I mean, they're the biggest, you can't even say arguably, they are the biggest state sponsor of terrorism.
Right. We have to keep in mind that those are not they're not attacking the United States with that, but yes, they're attacking the Arab states, and they're supporting the Houthis in Yemen. They're attacking Israel with Hezbollah, and also supporting Hamas in the south against Israel. So yes, they are a sponsor of terrorism. It's not directed at the U.S., but it's directed at its U.S. allies.
And prior to this very controversial Iranian agreement being signed, the one stalwart opponent of it was Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel. He actually addressed the U.S. Congress prior to the Iranian nuclear agreement becoming an agreement. How do you foresee history playing out in this with the agreement? Will Netanyahu be proven to be correct, and not just the threat of Iran, but that he thinks it gives them quicker access to build the bomb, and he, as well as Israel, as well as the West, we all have our suspicions of what Iran's true intentions are. I mean, it's just wait until we open Pandora's box, and then 5-10 years from now, or maybe not 5, but 8-10 years from now, we got an issue on our hands that we should have cut the snake's neck off back then. Well,
I don't think, as in North Korea, we didn't have too many good military options, and the Israelis have even less, because they have less capabilities of bunker busting weapons. A lot of these facilities are buried under tons of cement, and it's very hard to get there. You have to get a bunker buster bomb, which is one of these bombs that we just used, the Moab in Afghanistan, or other types of bunker busting weapons. And the Israelis don't have as many of those. So it would have to be the U.S. that struck Iran. But you have to find all the weapons, and our intelligence isn't that good in the Middle East. And also you have to have the weapons to take out all this stuff. So if you don't take it out, they're just going to redouble their efforts to get it, and in secret and underground probably. So there wasn't really a good military option. So I think the nuclear agreement was about the best that could be done. And the Israelis may be suspicious of it, but also the Israelis, I think, were sort of using it as a negotiating tactic to get more military aid from the U.S., which they did. Where it used to be $3 billion a year, Obama hiked it up to almost $4 billion. So, yeah. Also, Israel has a better situation than one might anticipate from Netanyahu's rhetoric. They have already 200 to 400 nuclear weapons. They're the only nuclear power in the Middle East. They don't squawk about, they don't advertise these weapons. But even if Iran got a couple bombs, Israel's military has always outclassed all its neighbors. And I think the threat of Iran should be put in perspective, even if, in the worst case, Iran broke out of the agreement and got nuclear weapons.
But Iran is, they're using their proxies of Hezbollah and Hamas. They dig these underground tunnels. So putting aside nuclear weapons, they've got that to deal with.
Well, certainly Israel has a problem with that. But, if you look back in the bad old days when Israel was surrounded by Arab neighbors, and Egypt, which is the most populous and deadly state for Israel to be, scared of, they've been at peace with Israel for a long time, and the Camp David peace agreements in the late 70s took that out. Syria is in the middle of a civil war. So these small terrorist groups are certainly a threat to Israel, but their overall security, I think, is much better than it was in the 1970s. When they were at war with 67, 1973, they were at war with some pretty serious militaries in the Arab states.
And if you're just joining us just now, this is Live from FSS. I'm Scott Wolfson, your host and the owner of Florida Sun Studios. We want to invite all of you to join the conversation by sending us your questions and comments. Live from FSS is not only the show that we broadcast every week, it's the professional platform, a complete turnkey solution for anyone who's interested in hosting their own show, complete with all the bells and whistles you see every day on network news, sports, and reality TV, multiple camera angles, graphics, titles, in-studio guests, remote Skype video calls, and much, much more. Want to give a shout out to Brad and Nadine who are watching the broadcast today, as well as Dr. Lisa Palmer. Thank you all for tuning in. We very much appreciate it. Getting back with Ivan Eland, who is our guest today, the U.S. recently abstained on the vote to sanction Israel for settlement building. And a lot of critics said it was kind of a slap in the face to Israel because it paved the way for the UN to come down on Israel. What is your take on it?
Well, I think that the U.S. should keep prodding Israel over these settlements because I think they're the main impediment to peace. And I think everybody would be better off, both Israel in the long term and the Palestinians and all the Arabs would be better to solve this crisis. War and conflict is always, there's somehow, some people think that war and conflict adds to your economy. It may add to the arms builders, but your general economy deteriorates. So if you have conflict, it impedes investment, and even in Israel. And I think it would be better off to settle this. Now, that's easy for me to see. I'm sitting over here in the United States, right? And I'm approaching it. Most experts can see a solution, a two-state solution, and they've seen it for years. The problem is that the parties on the ground don't trust each other, and there's a lot of hatred on both sides. And I think that it's much easier to say that you can settle this than you can. And I think the United States, when George W. Bush came into office, he had a very smart idea. He was going to stay out of this. But of course, he got dragged into it. And I think Trump is his son-in-law Kushner has an interest in it. So I think the more you put efforts into solving this problem, usually the more counterproductive it ends up being. And I think the United States certainly can be a moderator or a interlocutor in any solution, but I think the parties have to be ready to solve it, and right now they're not. And I think the U.S. should probably stand aside and let others. When the Oslo process was in form, the U.S. had nothing to do with it.
Right, but back then, and people would argue back then, Israel apparently gave 95% of what was agreeable, and Yasser Arafat turned it down. And some people would say, but Ivan, how can it be the settlements that's the problem? You have another side, on the Palestinian side, the leadership, Fatah and Hamas, which is a recognized terrorist organization. People would say, well, they are committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. So if someone's committed to your destruction, it doesn't matter if you gave them all your land. They want you to die, basically destroy the state of Israel. So could there ever be peace if that's what's in their charter?
Well, I think, various sides come into the negotiation, and you see this with Donald Trump himself. He sets a high bar, and you negotiate from there. You don't. One of the only things that the Palestinians have to offer is recognition of Israel. Otherwise, Israel,
which they're not willing to do.
Well, the reason they're not willing to do it is because they feel that Israel is settling on the state that they're supposed to get, right? And so they're withholding that because they don't have too many cards to play, I think. And the settlements are definitely impeding the two-state solution, and we may be at a point where the two-state solution is teetering or maybe even not even possible anymore. So,
this has been going on for thousands of years between the two sides. But do you foresee, even if Israel, if the settlements weren't an issue, let's say they weren't an issue, and they came to an agreement on the 48 borders, the 67 borders, whatever they decided upon. If your leadership, the Hamas leadership, which is very powerful, they overtook Gaza from Fatah several years ago. How how could you negotiate with someone whose charter calls for your ultimate destruction?
Well, of course, Hamas gets its, every movement depends on popular support, and Hamas gets its popular support from Palestinians who feel that their land is being taken. And so that's their perspective on the matter. And so I think both sides have to appreciate that, there's negotiating room. And they're just not doing it right now. And I'm not sure it's in the U.S. interest to get too involved in this because it's going to lead nowhere. And like I say, presidents get dragged into this. They try to solve it, like Kerry tried to solve it. Clinton, when he was going out of office, he put on this, full court press to solve it. And what happened? The Intifada happened shortly after, he left office. And I think sometimes we really put on these efforts to solve the problem. We raise expectations, and then it doesn't happen, and then we have more violence. And that, of course, leads to a downward spiral, and we're farther from peace than when we started. It's a really intractable problem, and I'm not sure something's going to have to give for there to be a solution, and it's just not happening right now.
When we look at everything that's happened the past decade or two, in the past 3 presidencies or more, and what can we learn from our mistakes, the history, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Syria or Libya, what can we learn from that going forward?
Well, I think in general, we could adopt the Eisenhower strategy. Doing nothing is doing something, right? Sometimes it's better to stay out of things until the right point in time, or maybe to stay out of them at all, like in Syria. And so we have to pick and choose our fights much more selectively than we've been doing. And, since World War II, we've been pretty much a policeman of the world. And one could justify that, I suppose, during the Cold War, although I think we even went overboard there. But after the Cold War, we just kept doing the same thing. And many of these regions are not strategic to the United States, and we need to start husbanding our resources because we have $20 trillion worth of debt, and our economy, it's come out of the Great Recession of 2008, but it's come out very slowly. And one of the reasons is because we have a huge amount of debt there, and that's dragging the economy. And it would be nice if we could free up some of these resources that we're spending in other countries and pay down the debt. I mean, maybe that's too much to ask for, but our politicians don't seem to care about it. But if they want to know why the economy is dragging, that's it, one of the reasons.
Right. I know we hit a lot of spots today, hot spots of North Korea, Syria, Iran, Israel, Palestinian conflict. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we didn't talk about today?
Well, I would like to just talk about our general overextension. We used to be the dominant economic power in the world, and we still have the largest GDP, but other countries have come up and become rich, and we've protected all these countries like Japan, South Korea, the Western European countries, the ones that Trump complains about. And I would agree with him there. I think these countries need to do more for their own defense and us to be a backup. Countless empires in the past have gone down simply because of financial reasons. The British and the French were on the winning side of both world wars. They don't have their empires anymore because those wars just drained all their finances from them. The same thing can happen to the U.S. We don't have a formal empire like the British and the French or the Soviets, but we have an informal empire where we police all these various regions, and it costs a lot of money to do that. And I think to avoid overextension, we need to, we have about 25% of the world's GDP, but we account for over 50% of the world's defense spending. So there's a big gap there.
Right. The next biggest competitor or country to us, we spend 10 times the amount. Was it 10 times the amount?
Well, we spend what the next 7 countries spend combined. And most of that's Russia, China, all our allies like the Japanese and British and French, who are the most capable militaries on the planet besides us. We have the most powerful military in world history, both absolutely and relatively to other powers. I mean, we're just totally dominant militarily. And so a lot of these resources could probably be rechanneled. I mean, and it's unique because our foreign policy does not correspond with our geography. We have very good geographical, as we were talking about at the beginning of the broadcast, we have a very good geographical situation. We have 2 giant ocean moats, we have weak and friendly neighbors, and we have the most robust nuclear arsenal on the planet. Nobody in his right mind would invade the United States because it can't be done right now and probably never can be done. And no one would even attack us because we can incinerate their country. And this keeps us really good, really safe. Other countries like Russia, China, they have fairly bad security situations intrinsically, but yet we spend what they do and those other 7 countries combined. So our defense spending doesn't really provide, it doesn't merely provide for the common defense as the Constitution requires. It provides for the defense of a lot of other countries.
But are you advocating for a reduction in military spending, or keep the status quo?
Well, I think we could probably even reduce the budget, but I don't see a need for a 10% increase when we're spending at such a rate. I mean, we're spending at higher than the Cold War average, and the threat during the Cold War, the only existential threat that the United States has ever faced in its history was the Soviet nuclear force. And the Russian nuclear force can also obliterate the United States, and it's the only thing that can do that in our entire history. But our relations, although strained with Russia, it's not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was much more powerful than the current day Russia. And I would say Russia is acting from a position of weakness rather than strength. If there's going to be any threat, it will come from China. But they're still, I think, only aspiring to be a regional power. So we probably should improve our relations with Russia if we can, to use as a counterweight against China.
But that's interesting you'd say they're acting from weakness, because other people would argue, well, look what they did in Crimea. Look what they're doing in Syria. They have their hands, their tentacles all over in the Middle East now, and Putin is not a stupid guy.
Well, I wouldn't say all over in the Middle East. Syria is really their only ally. And
well, Iran is too.
You would expect, well, in a transactional manner, not
right.
so much. It's just because Iran is helping. There's been a lot of tensions between Iran and Russia, but they have the same interest in supporting Assad and Syria because they both support him. But I wouldn't say they're natural allies. So I think Russia is, the oil price is down. One of the reasons that the Soviet Union collapsed was the oil price collapsed in the mid-'80s, and the oil price has been down and will probably continue to be down for a long time because of the U.S. fracking and that sort of thing. And the reason I think for Crimea, certainly I don't support them taking over Crimea, but it's a strategic military base, and they also have, they're also trying to prevent Ukraine from going into NATO by meddling in eastern Ukraine and taking over Crimea. They're trying to, one of their main purposes is that Ukraine does not get incorporated into NATO, because Ukraine has always been a key country in the Russian sphere of influence because of economics and because of political reasons and also military reasons. For the Crimean naval base is very important to the Russians.
I want to give a special shout out to Jerry Simonson, old colleague at the CNN Miami Bureau. Thank you for tuning in today, as well as a former CNNer who was here with his daughter Patty last week, George Chimenti. My dad Mark is watching the broadcast today. Hello to all of you guys. Also to Blair Sonberg. Thank you for tuning in. Ivan Eland is our guest today, and I can't say what a pleasure it is to have you in. I could listen to you for hours. I could probably just have tape recordings of Ivan Eland discussing foreign policy, because to me this is interesting, because I worry about my kids' future, not just our future. I look at the world and I'm like, what are the major threats that are affecting us? Being in the news business, I'm tuned in. I've got 4 monitors going at a time, whether it's CNN, MSN, Fox, and whoever else, maybe a local channel, and it hits home to me seeing a lot of this stuff, even though we're miles away from this. I mean, a lot of what's going on in the world, it could happen here, God forbid. And on a small scale, we have experienced some terrorist attacks.
Yes, we certainly have. But terrorists also have logistical issues, and we're far away from that. Now, 9/11 was the worst terrorist organization by a small group ever. And it's sort of an outlier. North America's always had very few incidents of terrorism, both before and after 9/11. So when the politicians tell you that they've kept us safe since 9/11, well, it may be nothing that they did. So it's certainly good to have a few improvements in airport security, but I think they've probably gone overboard in that, and so. You wonder how much is what the government has done, what has just been natural, say on aircraft. After 9/11, passengers got really surly. Previously, when a plane was hijacked, the idea by the passengers and crew was to cooperate. You'll land in Cuba someplace, and all the passengers will eventually be set free. Well, after 9/11, we saw planes used as missiles, and everybody dies. And we've had a couple incidents, the shoe bomber and the underwear bomber, where the passengers got really surly and captured the guy and wrestled him to the ground.
And that was due, thank goodness, to the vigilance of the passengers who were on the flight.
And you will see that when the paradigm changed. And the paradigm changed on 9/12, the next day after 9/11, we were safer than we were the day before, simply because the paradigm changed. The best security that we've had, I think, is the passengers and the crew on these planes now, that anybody trying to take over a plane knows that the people are not going to cooperate with them anymore.
And that's great, but maybe as a secondary defense, maybe we ought to rethink our security, our TSA security, our security at the airports, the airlines, much like they do with the El Airlines in Israel. I mean, they haven't had a terrorist attack in how long? I mean, they have among the stringent, most secure airport.
Yeah, I think although Israel is sort of in a war zone, and so whether you want to go that far, given that the threat is probably much lower here, I think that you need to calibrate your security procedures to the actual threat. And I think certainly we can learn from what the Israelis do. Now, they do behavioral profiling of people and that sort of thing there. But I think basically, we have a TSA, which isn't, it's, well, you're laughing.
Well, 95% of the fake bombs got through to the TSA.
I was just about ready to say that. Right.
I mean, how does that make me feel as a passenger who's flying the friendly skies? No pun intended. How does that make me feel as a passenger knowing that, oh God, during the test, 95% of these fake bombs got through? We have a false sense of security?
Well, I think we probably do. And I think the problem with this is that we've probably done too much in the airports and not enough in the cargo area and some of these places. Terrorists look for the weak link in the system and they try to exploit that. But the problem is you also have to take away the motivation of terrorists. Why are they attacking us? We have never asked that question ever since 9/11. We should have asked it even before 9/11. They attacked the embassies in Tanzania and Kenya under the Clinton administration. Why did they do that? Well, why do these groups attack the U.S.? Well, we're getting a little bit of imperial blowback. So if we don't need to be in some of these places, particularly a heavy footprint in the Middle East, that's driving some of the terrorism that comes back over here. We have less of it, but why have any of it at all, right? Or at least reduce it.
But more so than that, they only have to be right one time, one attack.
Well, that's the problem. We have an open society and we have a very large society, and they can attack just about anything they want.
So they could fail 99 times, but that 100th time that they plant that bomb or go after a soft target of ours, it just takes that one time to inflict damage and mass casualty.
Well, the good news is that ISIS has had very little luck recruiting Americans to go over and get experience being a real terrorist over on the battlefield in Syria and Iraq. What they've had to rely on is these inspired attacks. Some guy gets in his truck or his car and drives over people, and that's not good, but it's an amateurish attack which is going to kill a lot less people than a professional 9/11 style. Those were professional terrorists. I mean, those were very, and they were very effective at what they did.
And also, kind of jokingly, I think the ISIS benefit package is not all as meant to be. They have these training videos and they're very ingenious in how they recruit. But I think when some of these fighters that go over, these foreign fighters go over, they realize, hey, this is not all that it's cracked up to be. I don't think I belong here. I want to get out.
Yeah, yeah. The HR department for ISIS is good at recruiting, but when the benefits package, when the reality hits, ISIS is a very brutal group. And unfortunately, as you pointed out earlier, they're a derivative of the U.S. intervention in Iraq. Of course, the main al-Qaeda group, which had a falling out with ISIS, that was created by Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan when they went into Afghanistan. It seemed like a great idea at the time to give the Soviet Union its own Vietnam, but look what happened. We got al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda.
We trained bin Laden.
Right, and so we inadvertently created the only threat to the continental United States since the War of 1812, right, when the British invaded, right? So it's like we sort of create our own threats. And even in the War of 1812, we declared war on Britain before they declared war on us. So they were reluctant. So, if the main purpose of the government is to keep the citizens and the territory safe, our government has failed.
Failed, right.
They sent the jet interceptors out to sea on 9/11, and they were way too late to get any of the planes.
Right.
So, why? Because they put their emphasis on Air Force that project power overseas instead of defend the country. The Constitution, if you want to take a strict constructionist view, which a lot of Republicans say they do, but then we're supposed to provide for the common defense, and that's the first duty of any government. And our government is failing. In fact, the Department of Defense wasn't doing it. They should have renamed it to the Department of Offense or the Department of Defense of other countries, because we had to create the Homeland Security Department because the Defense Department wasn't doing its job in defending our borders, right? And I'm sorry to say that, but that's the reality of it.
If we have any American officials and congressmen and senators tuning in or on the rebroadcast, listen to Ivan. This guy knows what he's talking about. Maybe the world would be a safer place if they took your advice. I mean, it's easy to play Monday morning quarterback on a lot of these subjects, but we've got to learn from our history.
But let's take the Libyan intervention. We saw what happened in Iraq when we overthrew a leader. And it's an artificial society. You have three major groups in Iraq: the Shia, the Kurds, and the Sunnis. Well, Saddam was a brutal dictator. But what's the alternative? We have chaos. We have a new brutal system that the Shiites are oppressing, the Sunnis creating ISIS and other terrorist groups, right? So we took a look at that. Obama took a look at that and said, oh, geez, we got to get rid of Gaddafi. Well, Libya is an artificial country. It should really be 2 or 3 countries, right? And so now we have, again, chaos, terrorism, etc. So, and now, yet we have people like McCain and Lindsey Graham who want to overthrow.
Right.
They want to overthrow Assad. Well, what are you going to get? Well, you already have civil war, but Assad keeps the peace in his part of Syria. Now it's very brutal. He's a very brutal guy, but what do you really want to open the way for ISIS to take over the whole country? Because these people say, well, we got to have democracy in Syria. Well, you're not going to get democracy as we know.
We've learned our lesson from Iraq. We've learned our lesson from Libya. It's not going to happen. Israel's the only democracy there in the Middle East.
Yes, and so these people that want to do more in Syria, I ask why. It's why get involved in it when your enemies are fighting each other? Just let them fight, right? And I think Israel has the appropriate policy there.
Interesting stuff, fascinating conversation with Ivan Eland. Appreciate it so much for you being our featured guest today. Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you.
I know I kept you here a little later than I said, but I could speak with you for hours, and I'm going to have to pick up the recordings to listen later in my car. Ivan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And for all of you joining us today on Facebook, we want to thank everyone for joining us. Every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific Coast for you early birds, we have the Live from FSS show. And remember, Live from FSS is a show that we broadcast weekly right here on Facebook, but it's also the turnkey professional platform for you to get your message out there, promote your brand, your company. Florida Sun Studios, we service all the major news and sports networks, everyone from CNN, Fox News, ESPN, ABC, NBC, CBS. We're also a full-service video production company offering commercials, PSAs, internet shows, a Facebook Live show like this, or YouTube Live, or Periscope. And next week, we invite you all to join us again at 11 a.m. My guest for that hour show is going to be Tim Canova, a law professor, a newcomer to the political arena. And Tim is a fascinating guy. For those of you who remember him, we look forward to seeing you all next week at 11 a.m. Eastern as we go live from FSS. Thank you and have a great day.